Today's exhortation will be provided by Brother Adam Winfrey, and his remarks are titled Things Not Seen, and he has asked that we read from Jeremiah chapter 44. Turn to Jeremiah 44, starting at verse 15. We'll go through 19. Jeremiah 44, 15. Then all the men which knew that their wives had burned incense unto other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude, even the people that dwell in the land of Egypt, in Pathros, answered Jeremiah, saying, As for the word that you have spoken unto us in the name of the Lord, we will not hearken unto you, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goes forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then had we plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. But since we left off to burn incense to the Queen of heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, we have wanted all things, and have been consumed by the sword and by the famine. And when we burned incense to the Queen of heaven, and poured out drink offerings unto her, did we make her cakes to worship her, and pour out drink offerings unto her without our men? Give our attention to Brother Adam. Things not seen.
Morning, everybody. I'm actually not going to talk about that verse or passage at all, but it is a good springboard for the topic that I'm going to talk about. And I actually love that passage because it's a good example of bad logic in the Bible. The Israelites, really, the Jews at that point, believed that sacrificing the Queen of Heaven resulted in having crops and everything going well. And Jeremiah in the next passage says, well, no, that's not, you're getting it all wrong. Instead, though, I am going to talk about Canada. I'm going to talk about odometers, and I'm going to talk about the orbit of Mars. So you're in for a wild ride, but there is a point to all of it. So the first time I went to Canada was 13 years ago. For Operation Onesimus, which is sort of like a preaching course. It was held in Guelph, Ontario for 2 weeks. And just in case I needed money while I was there, when I crossed the border, I exchanged about $50 or 100 United States dollars for Canadian dollars. And as it turned out, the only time my peers and I needed money was halfway through the program to clean our clothes at the laundromat. And on the last night, we went out to buy ice cream. And on that last night, I remember being overly generous with my Canadian money, using up every last loony and toonie, because that's what their money's called, buying ice cream for a number of people because I knew that I was never coming back to Canada ever again. So some of you know, I've become very familiar with this drive for the past couple of years. I know every pit stop, every gas station along that particular route, and simultaneously I've driven a lot of miles. It's difficult to see here, but this Google Maps, it says it's going to take somewhere between 9 hours and 20 minutes and 11 hours and 40 minutes to get to Toronto from Richmond, which I can guarantee you it's never actually taken 9 hours and 20 minutes. It's been close to the other one. But it is going to be nearly or exactly 580 miles or 933 kilometers. So when I'm traveling this far, or really anywhere that requires I stop for food along the way, I'm always counting down the time remaining that my GPS predicts, that 9 hours and 20 minutes, or 11 hours and 40 minutes. This is one way that Julie and I differ. Julie always counts down the miles until she reaches her destination because, as she points out, the miles never change. If you're driving somewhere and the GPS tells you you're 45 miles away from your destination and it's going to take you an hour to get there, and then next thing you know, there's an accident somewhere ahead of you, or something happens that slows you down, that time changes. That hour can easily become an hour and a half, but you're still 45 miles away. So the technology used to calculate distances has become more and more exact over the years. And I'm not sure how Google Maps does it or any other mapping software, but I bet it's a mixture of actual measurements and algorithms. But before these existed, we had the trusted odometer. So some of you probably know what that is, maybe not everyone here, but the odometer is that little counter on your car's dashboard that counts every mile you drive. So at first glance, I assumed that the odometer in your car is more accurate than your GPS, but I found this on Lexus's website, that an odometer can be plus or minus 10% the actual distance traveled. And I found other sources that reported the industry standard is about 4%, but that's a variation of about 8,000 miles for every 100,000 miles you drove. So let's say you drive from here to Williamsburg, and that's 45 miles away. Well, like your car might actually say, well, it actually only took 40 miles, or it might say 50, just because the odometer is wrong. It doesn't know the exact distance. It's a bad guesser. So odometers aren't new by any means. The first mention of one of these in Western society was by a Roman named Vitruvius over 2,000 years ago. But they may have actually been invented 200 years earlier. Unfortunately, there are no artifacts or drawings of this machine, only vague written descriptions. Leonardo da Vinci was actually someone who attempted to build the odometer based off of Vitruvius's descriptions. Here's a picture of his drawing. So he couldn't make one that worked. So this just to kind of give you a concept of what's going on here. Imagine a wheelbarrow, and so you pick it up, and it has a gear on the wheel, and that gear turns a gear on top of, well, the top of the machine, and every so many turns, a pebble drops down a hole. And once that pebble drops down the hole, you know you've gone several hundred feet or a mile or something. So this is what Vitruvius described. Leonardo da Vinci, who was a really smart guy, he was a polymath, so he's best known for his artistic works, but he did a lot of inventions. He's actually said to have just done artwork so he could fund his inventions. But he couldn't make it work. In fact, no one could make one of these work. I also heard rumors that Thomas Edison had tried to make Vitruvius's odometer, and he couldn't get it to work. For centuries, people tried and failed. However, the Greeks and Romans made very accurate records of distance between cities. They had mile markers, they had wrote down in their log books how far things away from each other. Some of these are more accurate than the cars we drive. I think one record gave 0.2% difference, which is a lot better than the 3% difference that most cars give, or the 10% difference that Lexus promises. However, it is assumed that this machine never really existed because no one can build it. But about a century ago, there was a discovery that changed the game. In 1901, in the Aegean Sea, archaeologists discovered the Antikythera Mechanism, which sounds something like magical, but is actually named after the island it was found off of. It's approximated to have been created about 100 BC, and the machine is understood to be an astronomical calculator of sorts, something that could tell the owner what the night sky would look like on a certain date, which would be a good thing for things like sailing at night. And it's a little hard to tell from this picture, but they think that big circle was a gear, and there are other gears behind it, and there may have been like a lever you turned, and there's writing inscriptions around the outside of it. What was notable, though, about this technology, what was notable about this find is that the technology to do this, to make something like this, was generally assumed not to exist. What was more notable and equally exciting is that when they took x-rays of it in the 70s, researchers discovered gears with triangle teeth. I know this is really exciting. A few years later, a guy by the name of Andre Sleeswick, who was an engineer, he made a model of Vitruvius's odometer using the triangular teeth instead of the squared ones, and it worked. That's his model right there. You see the wheel and the teeth gears. So the problem was they were using a technology that I think was only available at the time of the Greeks until they discovered that they could make triangular teeth, which you wouldn't expect to be that much of a technological achievement, but there you have it. Now, this is the story of some machine that was once lost to antiquity. And admittedly, it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. It doesn't have anything to do with God. And it's a little bit of useless trivia that I learned about years ago. However, when I doubt the existence of God or miracles or anything metaphysical, I think of this odometer personally. And I think of it because it's the story of a lack of evidence. And it tells me that sometimes we're too quick to make judgments when we can't make sense of the facts that we have. So God is something that we feel should be there and that we want to believe in. And take Gideon. Gideon wanted to believe in God, but he needed help with this. In Judges 6, he asked, he was going to attack Israel's enemy, and he was really afraid. So at night, he went to sleep, and he said, God, like, if you're with me, please let the ground around me be wet, and the mat that I'm asleep on be dry. So he woke up the next morning, and that's what happened. His mat was dry, the ground around him was wet. And a second time, he asked God that night, let's have the reverse happen. Let's let my mat be soaking wet and the ground around me be dry. And he woke up the next morning, and that was the case. His mat was wet, and the ground around him was dry. He asked God twice for evidence that he was there to help, and twice God provided evidence. Now, I've asked evidence on more than one occasion, evidence that God exists, evidence that he's helping me. I've probably forgotten more times I've felt he's replied than I can remember. But when I felt like he was with me, my faith was restored. But we don't always give evidence that way, though. Sometimes we have to look elsewhere in prophecy, perceived perfection of nature, and patterns that present themselves in the universe, and the physical complexities that appear to be too vast to not be designed. So about 400 years ago, there was an astronomer named Johannes Kepler. He's sort of famous in the scientific community. One of NASA's space telescopes is named after him. There's a slew of things named after him. So you know he's important. And Kepler was given the task of determining what the orbits were of the planets around the sun. And so for context, Johannes Kepler lived about the same time as Galileo, but in different political climates. So he wasn't in as much of a dangerous scenario as Galileo. So Galileo, as a lot of you know, is famous for not only pushing the idea of heliocentrism, which is the belief that planets on our solar system revolve around the sun, not the Earth, but also being executed for that, although that might be part of a myth. Kepler agreed with Galileo. He agreed that the Earth didn't have the sun and the other planets revolving around it. He understood it as we understand today, that we're all revolving around the sun. And the other view, just to give it a definition, is called geocentrism. And people actually pointed to the Bible as evidence that the other planets and the sun revolved around the Earth. Kepler, who was Christian, spent a chapter in one of his books that he published arguing against that, arguing that the Bible actually had evidence that the Earth revolved around the sun as did the other planets. And I'm sure it's an interesting read, but the point I want you to take away from that is that we know that Kepler was a Christian, and that he was ahead of his time, and he was trying to reconcile his beliefs with scientific observations. So Kepler was given the astronomical observations of the planets of the night sky by another astronomer, Tycho Brahe. So these kind of look, I don't know if you were a kid, you had those like stencils where you put a pin in like a gear and you like move the gear and it makes this like weird squiggly drawing. That's what this reminds me of. So anyway, these are actually the logs in the night sky of the planets in our solar system as observed by observed from Earth by Tycho Brahe. And this funny one looking right here is actually Mars. What's curious about that, for the sake of today's world, is if we were to go to Mars, you see where it like kind of loops back in towards the center dot? That's when Mars is closest to Earth. And so if we were to go to Mars, we would need to go whilst doing that weird little loop thing. So he was given it by Tycho Brahe, who had one of the best telescopes in the world at the time, at least in Western society. So based on these patterns, Kepler was attempting to deduce the shape of each planet's orbit around the sun. So as a Christian, Kepler believed not only in the perfection of his creator, but also that his creator had made a perfect creation. And to this thinking, God must have given each planet an orbit with a perfect shape. So when he meant by perfect shapes, he meant perfect three-dimensional objects made up of squares, rectangular, triangles, and perfect shapes like that. So these are actually shapes, I forget the technical term, but they are named after him. And so he thought that the planets were orbiting the sun. It's hard to wrap your hand around, but in shapes like this. And he made this model, actually, and put it in one of his books of how he perceived the orbits around the sun were. So the circle, I think, is, maybe the inner circle is Earth's, somewhere in the center is the sun, but these are sort of how the planets go around the sun. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but he was trying to take the observations he's had and put them into this format. So when Kepler looked at the data he had, he tried to reconcile the data with his beliefs. And even though he wasn't able to prove this with the data he had, he published this idea in one of his books. However, at some point, Kepler decided that he may be wrong. He stopped trying to force his view of God into his observations of the world, and he tried something different. He tried imperfect shapes. And one of these is an ellipse or an oval. And he compared it to the data he had, and it worked. So he took the shape of an ellipse. I don't know how he did all these calculations, but he plugged it into his little abacus or whatever, and he figured out, oh, Mars is actually going around the sun, and the sun's at one end of this big ellipse. So it's not even in the center. Kepler, when he was doing this, he was looking for evidence in God, but the exact evidence he was searching for didn't exist. His problem was that he was looking for the wrong evidence. His faith, however, was not crushed by this. After his discovery, he understood the world a little differently, but his concept of a perfect creator remained unshaken in view of a seemingly imperfect creation. So we too come across things that challenge our view of God, scientific findings, injustice, suffering, and not just on a global scale, but on an individual scale. Unanswered prayers, these challenges can make us question who God is, or simply if he exists. And this is perhaps why Paul writes in Hebrews 11, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. And in verse 6, and without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he rewards those that seek him. The forefathers of our faith, and God for that matter, were and are aware of reasons not to believe in God. It's inherently and intentionally built into our relationship with God. He knows that we can't grasp that he's there all the time, and we're not expected to prove that he exists. We're not expected to justify the evil in the world and a supreme greater good that would allow it. But we are trusted to believe in God, to trust in him, and to await his reward. Thank you all for your time.